But that song always gets to me, because I often look into my own eyes and see things I don't like, places I haven't measured up, places I've fallen short. And then I realize when I look into his eyes, I see everything that I've wanted to be. I just don't trust myself with an extra microphone laying there. Fascinating thing happened in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve had created, were created, placed in this incredible garden, this paradise. Anna would have really appreciated not having pain in childbirth last week. You and I would have enjoyed having a little more fulfillment from our work. We really would have enjoyed it not having to sweat so much when we did do it. But beyond that, there's a thing that God gave to Adam and Eve in that garden that we lost. And it was called significance. And the battle has been on ever since the garden. And William Buford, who was a cable millionaire in Texas, retired at the age of 42. Most guys I know have a midlife crisis that involves a car or another woman, but for him it was just to retire. But he wrote a book called Halftime. And he talked about how for the first half of our lives, we are pursuing success. We want to be a successful preacher. We want to be a successful Christian. We want to be a successful husband or a successful wife. We want to be a successful secretary or whatever your job is. You wanted to be successful at it. You wanted somebody to look at you and say, well done, you've done a good job. In one way or another, you were being driven for success. When you go through midlife transition, it's not as important to be successful as it is to be significant. We want our lives to count. I don't know about you, but my life has changed to the point of I want to only invest in significant things or significant relationships. I want to be doing something that's going to matter for eternity. And the less I care about whether I'm successful or not, the less I care about whether you like me or not, the less I care about things that fade away. But I want to be investing in things that are significant. It's changed what I give to. It changes what I give my time to, my money to. It has changed a lot of things as I've grown older because I want my life to matter in somebody else's life. But we struggle with it. I want to look this morning at Bethlehem one more time because I don't know about it, but have you noticed that what stands out when you read about Bethlehem, whether it's in Micah or whether it's in Luke? There's a little jab in there about Bethlehem being a little town. I used to always kid Joyce about the town she grew up in and said that it said, "Welcome to East Rochester" on both sides of the sign. I used to kid her mom about living so far out into West Virginia that they had to pipe sunshine to her. And what do we say about people that come from a small town? We have names, don't we? But we're not going to call anybody names this morning. You've heard them, you've used them. We're not going there. I've lived in a town of 3,000 that never compared themselves to the big county seat that had about 15,000. They always compared themselves to the other town down the road that if it had 200 people if they were all home. you know? And they compared themselves by being better and more significant than the little place. Have you ever noticed that about Bethlehem? Let's look at some of these things. Because I find a comparison between Bethlehem and you and I this year. And one of those comparisons is that it was a small town. It was 5 miles south of Jerusalem, just in the northern part of the tribe of Judah's territory. And it was a small town. And it seemingly was always ridiculed for being a small town, even in the days of Jesus. Can you imagine? When I think most of them were small towns compared to what we have today. But secondly, it had small power. Now, I know that a lot of good things come in small packages, but think about it. Bethlehem is also known because of the census that Quirinius put in place. And the Roman government, the large Roman Empire, had the power to say, you will go register and you will pay taxes on that. Bethlehem couldn't say, no. They had no power. Have we seen that? I almost hate to mention this. Haven't we seen this? My friends from Indiana tell me they don't get near the political campaigns for presidency that we get here, because Indiana is just a small electoral vote. Nothing personal, Hoosiers. They didn't have much power. And there is a sense that sometimes that a small group of people cannot influence a large group of people. So it was powerless. Thirdly, it was Nowhereville. You know what I mean by that? You ever live in a town that didn't even have a state highway to it? You ever have a town that you couldn't get there from here? I think of that when I drive to Auburndale. It's so hard to get to Auburndale from here, at least where I go in Auburndale. And there's just something about Bethlehem that was not exactly on the beaten highway. It was kind of off to the side. It was known for shepherds. Just if you're familiar with Florida, you know that Orlando used to be a small town until the mouse showed up. And then I-4 began to really develop and populate between Tampa and Orlando and Daytona Beach, and it's now called the I-4 corridor. And you hardly know where Tampa ends until you get to Baseball City. Judah, Bethlehem was out in the sticks. Didn't want to go there. Number 4, it was an old town. It had rich history in the nation of Israel. It was old. And when we talk about insignificance, I look around and I see a lot of you that are getting old. You've bypassed me. I just know this much, that as I get older, my sense of significance sometimes struggles. Years ago, I visited a lady in a hospital who was up in years, and she was laying in her bed and pretty much confined to her bed. And I was talking with her and asked her what her struggles was, and she says, well, I don't feel like a Christian anymore. And I said, why not? She says, well, I used to teach Sunday school, I used to do this, and she listed all these wonderful things she used to do, and she was very successful at, that she couldn't do anymore. And so she felt insignificant. I don't know about you, but this body just refuses to do some things that it didn't do. In fact, last night I was sitting there thinking, I'm not feeling good tonight. I hope I'm overtired. And I went to bed. Do you understand what I'm saying? We struggle with significance when we can't do anymore. This lady who struggled with even a sense of her salvation because it was all based on her success, still in the middle of the night told me that in the middle of the night when her roommate cried for the nurses, and the nurses couldn't come. She somehow managed to get out of bed and go sit beside her and hold her hand. She started telling me about the lady that she could see catty-cornered out the door down the hallway, who every morning woke up and laid in a fixed position until this lady would smile at her. And I just want you to know that, I don't know about you, but as I get older, even though I want to be significant, I tend to struggle with it. It affects my decisions on where I invest my time and my talents and my money. Because I don't want to waste my time. It started to begin when I was 43 and went through that whole loss of spleen and mono as an adult, that I started making decisions based on what I had energy for and what I didn't have energy for. For example, I decided that crawling around on a cold cement floor, changing oil in 4 different automobiles was no longer on my priority list. I didn't have to prove to anybody that I was a mechanic, because everybody knew I wasn't. And things began to change based on what I had energy for and what was really, really significant. But I have good news for you this morning. I have good news for you. I want to talk about God's transformation. I want to talk about, first and foremost, David. David, what do we know him for? Great king of Israel, right? Great king of Judah. Probably one of the most beloved. In fact, God called him a man after my own heart. Do you know when he was called to be a king? That God said to Samuel the prophet, go to Bethlehem, find Jesse's family, and anoint one of his sons as king. And when he showed up, Jesse was scared. Usually prophets don't come with good news. And he says, I'm here to anoint a king. Can I see your sons? And so Jesse lined 6 of them up, from the oldest to the youngest. And Samuel looked at him and said, man, these are some fine-looking guys. We're in good shape. And went to one. Nope. God said nope. God said nope. God said nope. Went to all of them. Samuel says, I'm puzzled. God told me to come here to anoint your son, and yet when I get here, he doesn't tell me that any of these are him. Do you have any more? And this is what Dad said. Well, the baby of the family, who's really never make it as a king, he's out in the sheep. That's all he's good for. Samuel says, go get him. And when he came in, oh, and by the way, Samuel said, this is so important, we are not going to eat till he gets here. I know what some of you older children think about babies in the family. My mother, after my sophomore year in high school, would always introduce me as, this is my baby. See, I think a lot of times in our lives, we have a lot of people in our lives that tell us, you can't do that. You're never going to amount to anything. Why not? Why aren't you as good as? And God said, David will be the next king of Israel. Now, was he immediately king? Nope. He went through a lot of stuff so that God could create in him the person that he wanted to be king. It's a fascinating story. He went from a shepherd, he went from the baby brother to the king. See, that's what God does in our lives. Because I know parenting enough to know that you never, as parents, you never ever are 100% perfect in how you love your kids. And I'm going to say that as a kid, all of you had a parent or an adult or somebody else look at you and say, you'll never amount to anything. Can't you ever get this right? You didn't set the table right again. Or worse. And we struggle with being significant because it gets drilled into us. Secondly, disciples to apostles. Have you ever thought about who the disciples were? I read an article this week that said that somebody did a personality profile on all 12 of the disciples. And in that personality profiles, they said that there's only one that will amount to anything. And he is the one who has an accounting background, and someday he will become a really good bookkeeper or accountant or whatever. The other 11 are insignificant. By the way, the one who they thought would become an accountant became the treasurer of the group, and we know him as Judas. I went home one time, saw a father of a friend of mine who worked in the grocery store, and I asked him about my good friend John. What's he doing? And he says, oh, John became the police officer, and he's in line to become the police chief of our small town. I says, isn't that interesting? The one who has more speeding tickets than the rest of us put together became a police officer. And his response, without batting an eyelash or taking a breath at all, was, that's no more stranger than you becoming a preacher. God is in the transformation business. And the greatest thing that happens in our lives is when he transforms us from someone who is lost and selfish to a child that he says, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. How about Saul to Paul? Involved in persecuting the Christians, holding the coats, letters in his hands. Wow, transformation. How about that little boy with the sack lunch? The whole story. Shows up with his peanut butter sandwiches. Didn't even have a Capri Sun with him. All he had was a couple of fish and some bread. And even Andrew, when Jesus said, let's feed him. What do you got? They went out and scoured the crowd. Even Andrew, when he came back, says, well, I found this boy that he has a sack lunch his mom packed. But what is that with all these people? And one of my really, really favorite ones, but I'll come back to him later. I want to caution us about some dangers in our pursuit of significance. Okay? There's some really dangers out there we have to watch. We have to watch first and foremost that David didn't fit in to the wrong armor. See, I think there are times in our lives where we want to be so significant that we become so willing to fit into other people's expectations, other people's demands. If you do this, then I will. There's a psychology term out there for parents who tell their kids they will give them something if they do. I had this. I had a married couple, and he came to me one day and he says, Dad told me that he would give me a couple $1,000 if I would. And if I recall correctly, it was if I would leave my wife. Because she didn't fit into their expectations of a daughter-in-law. Saul gave David his armor and he about tripped in it. And he finally said, I can't do this. This is not me. I'm not going to perform to your expectations and your standards to be significant. I'm going to go fight that giant the way God has equipped me. Secondly, Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira, they wanted to get all the acceptance and the approval for being significant when they weren't. Remember the story in Acts? Big crowd showed up. They didn't have enough to eat, and so people decided that God touched their hearts and said, we're going to sell everything we own and give it to the apostles so that we can feed all these people. I don't know how that all works, okay? But Ananias and Sapphira saw what was happening. Yeah, just think about it. You sell everything you have and give it to the church, Tony. When people would go, wow. I don't know where you're going to live, but yeah, you might be surprised. But you see what I'm saying? And people were in awe. In fact, it talked about being in awe. And goodness, Ananias and Sapphira decided to get in on the fun. So they sold their place. And then they got together and they said, but we need to live, so let's keep some of it and just tell people we sold it for that. You know what? If they wanted to keep some of it, there wouldn't have been a problem with that in the world. But they wanted the pressure and the applause of their friends so much that they were willing to lie to God and to lie to the church, to look good. And that's a danger of seeking significance. Thirdly, the guy who, and I'm going to know if I got his name right, I can't remember if it's Simon or Simeon, but he saw what the apostles were doing. He says, how much is it? Can I buy that so I can have that power? You know, we want to use our money to get us there. That's a danger. Significance comes when I do something for somebody else that impacts their lives. I want to go back to Onesimus. Onesimus shows up in a story in the Bible in one little book called Philemon. It's fascinating, fascinating story. Favorite book of the Bible for me because I can read it in 5 minutes. Don't lose my train of thought. The story is that Onesimus was a slave for Philemon. In fact, he was not just a slave. He had elevated himself within the ranks of Philemon's business to treasurer. He kept the books. Fascinating that you trust a slave. Anyhow. Well, one day, or some days, or over time, he decided that he was tired of being a slave, and even though he had it good, he knew how to pilfer. And he took some of Philemon's money and ran out of town. And what every small town boy does is he ran to the big city for the glamour. He ended up in Rome. And sooner or later he was out of money, whether he spent it all or blew it, or whether he was robbed, which very likely could have happened. He ended up in jail. And in jail, his roommate happened to be Paul the Apostle. Talk about running from God. And you run into Paul. And through the course of time, Paul kept witnessing and preaching, and Onesimus came to Christ. But there was a problem. And the problem was this. Deep within his heart, there was something that nagged at him. You know what I'm talking about? The kind of stuff when you close your eyes and you try to block it out, it just keeps you up at night. The kind of things that when you come to church and you want to worship, you don't feel like you're connecting with God or other people and your worship feels empty. The kind of feeling that when you pick up your Bible to read it, it's dull. The kind of feeling that says, I don't feel like I measure up. The kind of feeling that says, why can't I break this habit? I know it's wrong. Why can't I break it? Why can't I turn it off? And in his fellowship and his sharing with Paul come up with a brilliant idea. Onesimus, you need to go back to Philemon and make it right. We don't talk about restitution much anymore, do we? But boy, that used to be a part of the process of coming to Christ, was to go back and make things right with somebody who you offended. Because if somebody stole something of yours and then they talked about knowing Jesus and how great it was, and all you can think about is what they stole from you, there's a problem. Onesimus says, excuse me? Let me get this straight. Did I hear you right? You want me to go back and meet Philemon, who not only am I a runaway slave, but I took a chunk of his money. Do you know what he's going to do to me? He will kill me First of all, for a runaway slave, which is allowed by law. And secondly, because I stole. I'm going to double death deal. I don't think so. Paul says, you know what? I know Philemon. Tell you what we'll do. I'm going to write this letter, and you take it back. Now, the letter gets interesting because it borderlines, if not crosses the borderline, on manipulation. I mean, Paul lays it on thick to the point of saying, now, Philemon, you know that you owe me your very life. Well, here's what gets interesting is, the name Onesimus means useful. Useful. People got names for reasons. And Paul uses that play on words in his letter to say, I know that Philemon became, I know that useful became useless to you. But I want you to know that if you would receive him back and accept him back into your fellowship, he would once again become useful to you. And if you don't want him in your household to be useful, send him back to me because he's very, very, very useful to me. Can I change the words? He who was once significant to you, who became insignificant, is now significant again. Bethlehem was a small town. You may feel you're a small person, but I just want to tell you something. You can be a very significant person in the kingdom. Do you know how often a smile changes someone's mind? Do you know how often a positive word helps somebody? Do you know how often a card sent to somebody makes a difference? Do you know how often a handshake makes a difference? Do you know that because of the grace of Jesus Christ, the transformation process takes you from someone who is insignificant to someone who is significant? I have really come to, over the last 20 years, to appreciate the story of the widow who came to church. And I just want to tell you something. They didn't take an offering at church in Jesus' day. They had a basket by the door. And I also want to tell you something else. Jesus stood by the basket. You know why I know that? Because he told the disciples, the woman who dropped in the 2 pennies just gave more than anybody else. Because she gave from the heart and she sacrificed. Significance. I find that sometimes the gift that comes from a person who sacrificed to give a little is far more significant. It is very significant in what happens. Because how many times is it not, we don't break the rock up with one single swing of the sledgehammer, but it's a consistent pecking away that eventually cracks a rock. I don't like breaking up cement. Too long, too painful, chisel at a time, hammer at a time, until it eventually cracks. Significance comes when we do the little things that affects people's lives, because it's about them, not about us. You know one of the dangers of visiting people in the hospital? It's more about us than it is them. I got to go because I feel like I have to care. But if I go with the understanding of caring and ministering to someone who's hurting, then it becomes significant. It's a gift of Christmas. It's a great gift. Father, help us in this day to understand how you